Hi everyone, this is the miter saw. So when you walk up to the miter saw, you always want to first check yourself. You want to make sure your clothing is appropriate. You don't have big sleeves that could get caught in the blade. You either want to pull them back or have tight sleeves to your wrists. You want to make sure you don't have anything dangling from your chest or earbuds or anything like that. And then you also want to make sure that you pull your hair back. If you have long hair, you do not want to get caught in a piece of machinery. So if you pull your hair back in a low ponytail is always best, then you personally would be ready to go. The second thing you want to do is you want to check your wood and make sure that it is appropriate to use on whichever machine that you're using. And in this case, you want to make sure that your wood has a flat bottom. If your wood had a rounded bottom and you go to use it on this machine, what happens is it rotates, and then when it rotates, it gets bound in the blade, and it is more likely to give you a kickback. Now, what a kickback does is if the piece of wood gets bound in the blade, the entire machine bounces, and it feels like it's sucking your hand into the blade if it is not actually doing that. And then it tends to throw the piece of wood. When it throws the piece of wood, it does tend to throw it that direction. So that is kind of your kickback zone, is that direction. But you want to make sure that you don't have that happening. So you're going to check your piece of wood, make sure it's appropriate. You're going to make sure you mark your cut that you are going to make on the piece of wood, so you're very clear where that cut is going to be made. You do want to make sure that wherever you are choosing to do that cut, that you are checking it by bringing the blade down without your hands on the trigger, and you are going to line that up to make sure that it is in the proper location. In this case, I want to make sure the tines of my blade are just barely touching my line. So that is the appropriate place for me to place my wood to make the cut that I want. But I do need to make sure that when I'm holding this down, that my fingers are at least 4 inches away from that blade. You also want to make sure that when you are cutting a piece of wood, so my grain travels this direction, you can kind of see the lines, and I want to go like against the grain. I would never want to cut this direction with the grain. If I were to do that, I would most definitely get a kickback, and it would throw the wood, and it never ends well. So you want to make sure that you're only cutting across the grain. So you would get this all lined up. I'm going to check. When I am holding onto the piece of wood, I want to make sure that I'm holding onto the piece of wood very tight. I want to make sure I'm pressing hard so it's down on the table, and then I'm pressing hard so that it is going up against my fence right here. I want to make sure that there is no way that this piece of wood is going to move when I'm getting ready to cut. So I place my hand, make sure it's at an appropriate location, distance from my blade, and then I want to make sure that it is solid. Next thing I'm going to do is I am going to turn on the machine. When I turn it on, there is a trigger down below, and then this is a safety button. You actually have to push both of those at the same time to get the machine to turn on. And so I would turn it on, and then I want to make sure that the blade gets up to speed before I actually pull it down through the piece of wood. If it doesn't get up to speed, it actually won't have enough power in order to make the cut. So if you pause just a couple of seconds, it will get itself up to speed. You just don't want to do this like really fast. And so you're going to turn it on, and then you would bring down, once it's up to speed, you're going to bring this down, and you're going to cut all the way through the piece of wood, and then you're going to make sure that you slide all the way back. So it goes all the way back until you kind of hear or feel that jerky motion. Now, the reason that you want to do that is if you're cutting and you come down and you slide forward, but you don't make it all the way to the back where you kind of feel where it stops, what happens is you're cutting the top surface, but you're not actually cutting the entire bottom surface. And there'll be a section of the wood that didn't get cut, and you'll have to reline it up and then cut it again. So you always want to make sure you kind of feel that it's fully stopped and it can't go any further back. Now, after you have made the cut, your hand is still going to be on the piece of wood. What you want to do is release the trigger and then slowly lift this back up until it gets all the way to the top. You don't want to flick it up. If you flick it up really quickly, often what happens is the piece of wood right here is going to shift. When it shifts, it hits the blade, and then you still get that kind of kickback, and it kind of flings the piece of wood there, especially if it's a smaller piece of wood. So you want to make sure you just bring it back up slowly. The last thing that you want to make sure that you do or don't do is you do not want to reach your hand towards a moving blade, even though there is a guard here. So your hand is still going to be on this section of the wood. So that one's easy. You can just grab that piece of wood and move it out of the way. This secondary piece of wood that is sitting here, you don't want to reach for it right away because that blade is still moving underneath your guard here. But if your guard were to malfunction or anything along those lines, you would be reaching your hand towards a live blade. So instead, you can grab your piece of wood, you can scoot it out of the way, or you can just wait until the blade stops and then you can grab your piece of wood. So that is how we use the miter saw.